The year 2026 has become a masterpiece of distraction, a relentless battlefield where your attention is the primary currency. In this age, the greatest fear of the modern man is no longer death, nor is it financial ruin or social disgrace. It is something far more subtle, pervasive, and terrifying. It is the absolute, paralyzing fear of being alone with one's own thoughts. We have built an architecture of noise that ensures we are never truly present. From the cold blue light of our screens in the early dawn to the final flickering images before an exhausted sleep, we are under a constant state of siege. The world has conspired to make sure you are never alone. You carry 1,000 voices in your pocket, 1,000,000 images in your eyes, and a constant, humming stream of digital garbage designed to keep you from facing the profound silence of your own soul. We have become a generation that is terrified of the void, believing that if we stop reacting, if we stop consuming, we will simply vanish into nothingness. But I tell you, in that very silence you flee from lies the only truth you will ever find. Christopher was once the high priest of this digital chaos. He was a man who lived his life in the fast lane of the metropolis, his existence defined by the constant vibration of notifications and the hollow roar of the crowd. He was a high-functioning addict of noise, filling every waking second with meaningless meetings, his evenings with shallow social circles, and his nights with the addictive glow of a television screen. He was terrified of the silence, believing that it was a vacuum that would suck the meaning out of his life. He didn't realize that his constant busyness was not a sign of vitality, but a desperate, sweating attempt to drown out the growing emptiness of his own spirit. He was like a man living in a house of mirrors who was too afraid to look into any of them, for fear of seeing the stranger looking back. Christopher was successful by every worldly standard, but inside, he was a starving man surrounded by a feast of shadows. His soul was crying out for a moment of stillness, but he was too busy answering the world's demands to listen. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a whisper. One morning, as the sun struggled to pierce through the city's smog, Christopher felt a sudden, sharp disconnection. He looked at his phone, his calendars, and his bank accounts, and felt absolutely nothing. The noise that had fueled him for decades suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud. He realized that for all his connections, he was the loneliest man on earth. He had become a master of the external world while remaining a complete stranger to his own internal landscape. He understood that if he didn't find a way to silence the world would eventually silence him. This was the moment he decided to walk away, not just from his office or his city, but from the very idea of who he was supposed to be. He was ready to go into the dark, to face the silence, and to discover if there was anything left of Christopher once the world stopped watching. Leaving the city was like shedding a second skin that had grown too tight. Christopher drove until the pavement ended, until the signals on his dashboard faded into static, and until the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of his own heart against his ribs. He sought out a place that the modern world had forgotten, a jagged, gray coastline where the salt air was thick enough to taste and the waves hammered against the rocks with a primitive, prehistoric fury. Here, far from the reach of the city's electric pulse, he found a small, weathered cabin that had been abandoned by time itself. This was to be his sanctuary, his laboratory for the alchemy of solitude. On that first morning, as he stood on the edge of the abyss, the silence was not the peaceful retreat he had imagined. It was heavy, violent, and intimidating. It pressed against his chest like a physical weight, making every breath feel like a deliberate act of will. There was no one to impress, no one to argue with, and no screen to tell him what to think or how to feel. The withdrawal was physical. Christopher's mind, wired for the high-speed chaos of 2026, went into a state of frantic shock. He found himself reaching for a phone that wasn't there, his thumb twitching in a phantom gesture of scrolling. He felt the vibration of notifications in his leg, a ghost limb of his digital addiction. His brain was screaming for a hit of dopamine, for a conflict to resolve, or for a piece of news to analyze. The silence was like a mirror that reflected every insecurity, every regret, and every lie he had ever told himself. He felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get back in his car and drive back to the familiar noise, even if it meant certain death for his spirit. He was terrified of the clarity. In the city, he could hide in the crowd, but here, there was nowhere to run. He remembered the words of an ancient sage, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He realized that he had been a fugitive for 40 years, running from the only person who actually mattered. For the first month, Christopher lived in a state of internal war. Every thought that entered his mind was a weapon used against his resolve. He thought about the projects he left behind, the people who would judge him, and the irrelevance he was courting. But slowly, the fever began to break. The noise in his head, once a deafening roar, began to settle like dust after a storm. He began to notice things he had never seen before, the way the light changed from silver to gold on the surface of the sea, the intricate patterns of the moss on the stone walls, and the deep, resonant sound of the wind through the eaves of the cabin. He was unlearning the language of reaction and relearning the language of observation. He was no longer a victim of his thoughts, he was becoming their witness. He began to understand that solitude was not the absence of people, but the presence of oneself. He was no longer lonely, he was finally, for the first time, beginning to be alone. As the weeks bled into months, Christopher's apprenticeship in the Alchemy of Solitude took a deeper turn. He began to understand that there is a profound difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a hunger of the ego, a desperate, starving reaching out for something, anything, to fill a hole that can never be satisfied from the outside. Solitude, however, is a feast of the soul, a deep, nourishing, and sacred communion with the eternal self. In the cabin by the sea, he watched as the layers of his artificial personality began to peel away like old, sun-blistered paint on a ship's hull. Without an audience to applaud his successes, he had no reason to perform. Without critics to judge his failures, he had no reason to defend his pride. He discovered that beneath the frantic, surface-level noise of his ego, there was a steady, rhythmic strength that was as old as the mountains themselves. He was discovering the bedrock of his character, the part of him that remained when everything else was stripped away. He developed a daily ritual of silence that he called the inventory of the void. Each evening, he would sit in total darkness, allowing his thoughts to drift past him like clouds across a vast, unchanging sky. He didn't try to catch them, he didn't try to change them. He simply watched. He saw his fears, his ambitions, and his desires for what they truly were, temporary weather patterns in the climate of his consciousness. This practice gave him a lethal kind of clarity. He realized that the world of 2026 had spent decades convincing him that he was a fragment, an incomplete puzzle piece that only found its value through the attention and approval of others. But in the deep, unyielding silence of his solitude, he found that he was a whole world unto himself, a complete universe contained within a single human heart. He was no longer a beggar for attention, he was becoming the king of his own internal territory, a land where no external voice could dictate the laws of his peace. This period of his life was marked by a strange and beautiful simplicity. He found joy in the labor of survival, chopping wood, drawing water, and mending his clothes. These acts, once seen as beneath him, became a form of meditation. He realized that when you do something with total presence, the division between the self and the world disappears. He was no longer Christopher the executive or Christopher the success story, he was simply Christopher, a man who breathed, worked, and existed in harmony with the tides. He began to practice the strategy of the still water. A turbulent lake, whipped by the winds of social pressure and digital gossip, reflects only distortion. But a still lake, deep and undisturbed, reflects the entire cosmos with perfect clarity. By quieting the storms of his social needs, Christopher was becoming a mirror for the profound. He was finding the frequency of eternity in the midst of the mundane, and he realized that this was the only wealth worth possessing. There is a specific, quiet kind of power that comes to a man who no longer needs external validation to feel whole. It is a power that the world cannot give, and therefore, the world cannot take away. Christopher found this power in the most ordinary moments of his solitude, the way the frost formed intricate patterns on the glass at midnight, or the rhythmic, grounding sound of his own breath as he sat on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. He understood now that the most important conversations a man ever has are the ones he has with himself in the dark, when there is no one to impress and no one to lie to. These are the conversations that build the internal fortress, the spiritual infrastructure that allows a man to stand firm when the world is crumbling around him. He was no longer afraid of his own shadow, he had invited it to sit by the fire, and in doing so, he had integrated the fractured pieces of his soul. He began to realize that his previous life had been a series of ego shocks, constant reactions to the opinions and expectations of people who didn't even know him. He had been a puppet moved by 1,000 invisible strings of social media, news cycles, and corporate politics. But in solitude, those strings had been cut. He was learning the art of self-reliance, the ability to generate his own motivation, his own joy, and his own sense of purpose. He saw that most people are terrified of being alone because they are terrified of the person they have become. They use noise to distract themselves from the fact that they have no internal life. But Christopher was building a cathedral inside his mind, a place of beauty and stillness that he could retreat to at any moment. He was mastering the alchemy of solitude, the process of turning the lead of loneliness into the gold of spiritual independence. This mastery didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, sometimes painful process of shedding the old and embracing the unknown. He had to learn to forgive himself for the years he wasted on the trivial. He had to learn to love the silence even when it told him things he didn't want to hear. But the reward was a sense of peace that was so deep, it felt like it was part of his very DNA. He was no longer a fragment of the crowd, he was an individual in the truest sense of the word. He understood that the man who can be content with a simple bowl of rice and a quiet room is the most dangerous man in the world, because he cannot be bought, he cannot be threatened, and he cannot be controlled. He had found the ultimate freedom, the freedom from the need to be understood by anyone but himself. When the time finally came for Christopher to descend from the coast and step back into the world of men, he did not return as a man seeking connection or a performer seeking a stage. He returned as a man who brought his own light, his own silence, and his own internal gravity with him. He walked through the crowded, frantic streets of the city of 2026, but the chaotic energy of the masses could no longer penetrate his skin. He was like a ghost in the machine, moving through the noise but not of it. He had mastered the supreme human ability, to be perfectly alone even in the center of a screaming crowd, and to be profoundly content even in the absolute absence of external stimulation. He had become the silent king, a man who ruled over the only kingdom that truly matters, the one within his own heart. My friends, as you navigate the turbulent storms of this century, do not be afraid of the silence. Do not run from the void that opens up when the screens go dark and the voices of the world fade away. It is in the moments when you are most alone, when the world has forgotten your name and your status, that you are closest to your true and hidden power. Stop seeking the world's cheap applause and start seeking your own quiet respect. Build a life and a mind that you do not feel the constant need to escape from. Become the still water that reflects the stars, even when the mud of the world is thick around you. In a world that is losing its collective mind to the noise of the unimportant, the man who is comfortable in his own company is the only one who is truly free. He is the only one who can hear the music of life over the roar of the machine. Christopher found his soul in the cold salt air and the deep silence of the sea, and I promise you, yours is waiting there too. It is waiting just beyond the reach of the next notification, just on the other side of your fear, waiting for you to have the courage to stop and listen. The world doesn't need more people who are informed, it needs more people who are centered. It doesn't need more voices, it needs more presence. The path to your true self is paved with silence. Walk it with courage, walk it with patience, and walk it alone until you realize that you were never alone to begin with. The alchemy of solitude is your birthright. Claim it, and you will find that the world has no power over a man who has found everything he needs within himself. This is the end of your search, and the beginning of your true reign. Be still, and know that you are enough. The silence is not your enemy, it is your oldest and truest friend. Welcome it home.